Hello, this is Tracy Drummond. I'm here today with Sherry Cooper. We are in North Kansas City, Missouri at the Machinist District Lodge 142 office. Today is August 17th, 2015, and I will be interviewing Sherry about about everything, but in particular about her career with TWA. Welcome, Sherry, and thank you for agreeing to do this interview with us.
Well, thanks for asking me to come here.
So the question I always start with for everyone, as I told you earlier, is where and when were you born?
I was born in Bakersfield, California. Actually, it's kind of humorous. I was an 8-month baby. My mother went into labor early, and I was born on a train, and they dropped me off in Bakersfield, and she went on to Torrance, which is where we were, and she came back about 4 months later and picked me up. So technically it's Bakersfield.
So who did you stay with in Bakersfield?
At a maternity hospital.
Okay.
And so, I've always had transportation, I think, in my system. Either the train ride agreed with me or didn't agree with me, however you want to look at it.
Right.
But I was born early on a train.
And so a maternity hospital, I have to tell you, already I've heard of something I've never heard of before. So were those more popular?
I think back then they didn't have a lot of hospitals in Bakersfield, and this just happened to be a maternity hospital that they found there. And I was a preemie, and they took me to the closest maternity hospital they could find.
Okay.
Because they needed, obviously, an old-fashioned incubator, because I was born early. So that was the history of that.
And so the nurses just cared for you for the 4 months. How far apart are Bakersfield and Torrance?
It's about 200 miles away, 250 miles away. It was L.A. and Bakersfield. So.
Okay. So what was your mother doing in Torrance?
That's where they were living at the time. And I had an older brother, and she went back to Torrance. They, in fact, told her she was Rh negative, and back in the 50s they didn't have all the testing they have now, and I was Rh positive, and they literally said, we'll call you when the baby dies, come back to get her. And here I am 62 years later.
Right.
But it was just one of those things.
Wow.
The medical sciences made great strides, which they didn't have back in the 50s. So
Okay. And what were your parents? So your parents were living in Torrance.
Mm-hmm.
Were they originally from Torrance?
It was military. My dad was in the military, so that's where they were.
Okay. And so they came and got you after 4 months, and you moved back to Torrance with them.
Right, and then I moved back. My mother's from Marion, Indiana, so we ultimately moved back there, and then we moved to St. Louis when I was 5.
Okay. And was your father still in the military?
He was out of the military by that time.
By then, okay. And how old were your parents around that time?
My mother was exactly 30 years. She was 30 when I was born, and my dad was 3 years older, so he was 33.
Okay. And so first California, and then in very quick succession back into Indiana. And then by the time you're 5, you're in St. Louis.
Correct.
So what got your parents to move from Indiana to St. Louis?
By that time, my dad had started his own business. He had worked for American Tobacco as a distributor, a sales rep. And then he decided to start his own business in St. Louis. And he worked making pipe fittings for McDonnell Douglas, which was an aircraft manufacturer in St. Louis. And my mother actually worked at McDonnell Douglas in St. Louis, and then he sold tube fittings to McDonnell Douglas.
Okay. What kind of background did he have that led him to that career?
Well, as I told you earlier, my paternal grandfather, was a coal miner in West Virginia. And my father made it very clear to all of us at an early age that the only way to get out of what was Appalachia poor back then was through college education. He graduated from Glenville College, State College in West Virginia, and then went back to Marshall and got his teaching certificate. And shortly after he sold his business, his tube fitting business, he became a school teacher.
Okay. And he would have been mid to late 30s by then?
Yeah, he went back to school when I was like 9 or 10. He had to go back to school and would come home on Thanksgiving and Christmas, just like a regular college student. And he got his teaching certificate in the late 60s and taught in St. Louis, and then ultimately moved all of us to Florida after a rather disastrous winter in St. Louis that he decided he hated cold weather. So we moved to Florida in 1968.
Okay. Why was it important for him to go back to school and do that? Was it something he'd always wanted to do?
He realized from a very early age that education was key to anything. He stressed that we needed he has 4 children. All 4 of us have college degrees. My brother has a law degree. I have a law degree. My sister has her master's. My younger brother has his BA. But he knew that if you wanted to make it as far as a middle income family, you needed to have, number one, a college degree, and depending on your occupation, a union was critical in ensuring appropriate wages.
Okay. And you were in St. Louis, and he taught for a very short time. Would you like to share with us the Disastrous event?
Well, he taught inner city St. Louis, which is predominantly black. He was driving home from work one afternoon in a horrible snowstorm, got stranded on Lindbergh Avenue in St. Louis, had to walk 5 miles home and said, "That's it, we're through with winter. We're moving to Florida where it's sunny and warm." And so that in 1968, we actually moved to Florida.
What part?
Close to West Palm Beach, a little town called Jupiter.
Okay. And did he continue to teach?
Yes, he taught at Palm Beach Gardens High School, which was another small city adjacent to Jupiter. My mother, by that time, had gone back to school and was teaching at Jupiter High School. And so he taught until he died in 1982. He was 62 when he had a heart attack and died.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, as you said, education was incredibly important for your family.
Correct.
And the question that I often ask is, what was expected of you when you finished high school? But you sort of already answered that everybody in the family went and got a college degree.
There were, as I said, there were 3 things that he taught us. Number 1, you get a college education. Number 2, you never vote for a Republican, you always vote for a Democrat, because only the Democrats cared for individual working people. And number 3, that a union is critical to ensuring a middle class lifestyle.
So you moved around a lot in your younger years. Was that stressful?
Not really. I think it made you, at least it made me, be more aggressive in making friends, because you were new to a school, and so you had to put yourself out there to get to know people. My first year that I moved to Jupiter, I was senior class vice president. I was secretary of the student council, and the only way to make people know you was to be active in school or whatever events that you were involved in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I sort of have a feeling you've never had an issue with shyness, particularly.
Not really.
So you finished high school in Florida, and then you went on to get your bachelor's degree.
Correct. At UF, go Gators.
Okay, all right. And political science. So what was appealing about political science?
Again, my father was very politically involved. We sat down as a family. We watched the news every night. We had a newspaper at the home that we would all read and we would discuss. So political events was always very important to our family. I love political science. I was very active in the 70s against the Vietnam War, demonstrated. I was very active in civil rights because that was something that was the right thing to do. I think that was the one thing that my father taught me was it's easy to do the right thing, because no matter how it turns out, doing the right thing is the only way to do something. And I think that political science was a natural evolution of how we were raised.
Okay. And what was as you were taking your political science coursework, what was sort of your focus or interest when you were?
Well, I think, both my older brother and I are attorneys, so I think we always assumed that we would go on and get law degrees. And it was a strong major, and it was something, of course, that was entertaining and interesting. Mm-hmm. And I think the natural evolution of being involved in world events seemed like a given that I would be in political science.
Okay. So you get your BA, and that year was?
75.
75. And then what do you do?
Well, I started teaching 8th grade math, and there was an advertisement
in Florida,
in West Palm Beach, in Jupiter, and there was an advertisement that Eastern Airlines was hiring flight attendants, and Eastern was very big in Florida. And my mother had flown for TWA when she was...
That's right. We didn't mention that.
Yeah,
so tell me a little about that.
My mother, in 1945, this is, of course, after the war, from a small town in Marion, she and a girlfriend applied and were hired by TWA as hostesses back then. So she had flown, and I remember as a kid playing in her uniforms and looking at all her memorabilia.
And who did she fly for?
TWA.
Oh, it was TWA? And what were her destination cities? Did she...
Then it was strictly domestic. Okay. She flew Connie's and Stratoliner. She flew... she was based out in California and flew puddle jumpers across the United States. But back then, you couldn't be married and be a hostess. And as I told you, it's easy to hide the fact that you're married because you don't put your wedding ring on. Mm-hmm. But you obviously couldn't fly, too, if you were pregnant. And when my older brother came along, then she had to quit. Okay. So when I was in the summer, when Eastern Airlines announced that they were hiring, also United and TWA had applications in the local paper. I went to the Eastern Airlines interview and was hired, but I didn't like their destinations. They were predominantly north and south eastern corridor, Miami, New York, that type of thing. And United, I went to Chicago, and I didn't want to spend a winter in Chicago. So that was ruled out because I was, certainly a Florida person at that stage. And then TWA, I came to Kansas City for my interview, and that was in October of 1974, and was hired then, and finished up my teaching contract, and then came to TWA in 1975, June of 75.
Okay. Tell me about training. Well, were you particularly dissatisfied with teaching? Is that why you were looking for something else?
I think it was the travel. I wanted to fly international, which was TWA. Mm-hmm. And I thought, honestly, that I would do it for 6 months, get the travel bug out of my system, go to Europe, and then come back and go to law school. I didn't see teaching as a career as much as I saw it as a means to saving enough money to go to law school. So when I started flying with TWA in 75, I flew 1 month, turned into the next, and I found out that I enjoyed it more than I thought I would, or enjoyed it more, as much as I thought I would, if not more. And then finally decided that I needed to go to law school because it was something that was always on my plate or on the horizon. So I went to law school in 78. My first year, I did take 9 months off from TWA and go full-time. The last 2 years, I actually flew and went to law school at the same time. So I had...
How did you manage that?
It was hard. I went to school. I took my classes Monday through Thursday at UF in Gainesville, and then I would catch a flight on Eastern through Atlanta and fly to New York, and fly Friday, Saturday, Sunday, come back Sunday night, and go to law school Monday through Thursday. So I did that for 2 years, we're basically working 7 days a week and or going to school at the same time.
That sounds exhausting.
It was hard. I mean, but I was very motivated to finish it, and I wanted to do it full time, and I wanted to get it done with. So it worked out really well for me, being able to fly international on the weekends and then go to law school during the week.
How did you study?
I studied on the airplane. I studied going to and from New York. I would study on layovers. I would study on the plane when we had crew breaks. I always carried my books with me everywhere, which, that back then we had wheelies. We didn't have the rollerboards they have now, and I would break wheelies consistently because the books were so heavy. But I would just carry my books and study whenever I could. And actually graduated with honors, believe it or not.
I totally believe it. I totally believe that you graduated with honors. So maybe your destination was Paris and you had to spend the night and you didn't go out and enjoy Paris. You studied.
I would go out. I would just not stay out as late as I would have normally. I would get to the hotel because you were flying all night long. And I would sleep a couple hours, get up, have a cup of coffee, go to the museum, come back, study, go out to dinner with the crew, come back, study, and then go to bed, and then you work your way back to the States.
Okay. So what was flight attendant training like?
Flight attendant training was in Kansas City.
And I guess y'all were still called stewardesses at that point.
We were actually flight attendants at that point.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay.
After the 70s, they stopped calling flight attendants stewardesses, and they went into the 80s, 70s, it was flight attendant.
Okay.
Because you have to remember, at the time, they hired males.
Okay, so they
Before it
started
was predominantly female.
Right.
I mean, the evolution, it was single women, then it was single women, married women, no children, and then it was women with having to retire at age 35. And the EOC said no, and you couldn't wear glasses. So it was very definitely an evolution from being the hostess or stewardess into something that was more of a career. Mm-hmm. So, and one of the things that helped evolve the flight attendant was having to, or hiring males to serve as flight attendants. Okay. And that was in the 70s.
And tell me about your training.
It was 6 weeks of training at Breach Academy, which was here in Kansas City. You went, and basically you'd have a day off about once every 2 weeks, but you had, during the day you would be in a classroom and they would teach you safety, and then you would have dining, and then you would have more safety, and then they would quiz you the next day, and you'd had to jump in a pool and put on a life vest. You had to be able to float for so many, or swim for a certain period of time. You had to tread water. Then you would have to go back into dining and pass dining tests and how to set up a first class cart. If you remember back in the 70s, it was far more elegant service. You'd have 5 or 6 carts going across the pond, as it called, going across the Atlantic, with an appetizer cart and a Chateaubriand cart. You had to learn how to carve meat and how to serve caviar, and a wine cart and a cheese cart. So it was very extensive, the training, because it was the old white glove service that people expected in the 70s and 80s.
So even if there were only, say, 12 people in first class, you had to break all of that out.
It didn't matter.
It didn't matter.
1 or 20. You did the same thing each time.
Okay. So, and for all the folks in, I guess what we'd call economy today, did it have a different...
Well, back then it was coach, but they had a choice of 3 entrees in coach.
Okay. So you still had dinner service for
you just served on trays, where in first class it was linen. Everything was done on linen. No one ever was served an actual tray in first class. It was... TWA was known as the airline of the stars. I mean, you'd have... I served Elizabeth Taylor, and I served Debbie Reynolds, and I served Paul McCartney, and you had true Hollywood stars on airplanes traveling to and from Europe, so you needed to have an impressive service.
Okay.
Elizabeth Taylor, by the way, was absolutely gorgeous.
Oh, I'm sure.
And her eyes were, and the nicest person you would ever want to meet.
Really?
Very down to earth, very kind. She, on the flight to London, she got on with no makeup and was still stunning. Those eyes were violet. And she goes into the lab, and of course she had, how many years of makeup experts taking care of her. She 5 minutes later came out and was breathtakingly beautiful. And the kindest, sweetest person you'd ever want to meet.
Were there, I imagine, like with this example, they were people that y'all were sort of giddy that they were getting on the...
Yeah, she was one. Just because she was so kind. Mm-hmm. Debbie Reynolds was very, very sweet. Mm-hmm. Very kind, very... And she went through all her marriages and her trials and tribulations and she was the unsinkable Molly Brown in a lot of ways. That was her personality and very bubbly. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, the old stars were very kind, as far as how they treated us with respect.
Okay. When you started training to become a flight attendant, I asked you about this earlier. What kind of training do you get for emergencies or for inclement weather or to keep people calm when they might be freaking out and it's not really it seems like a much bigger deal than it is?
Well, most of us had flown before, so we were somewhat used to, flying, but they actually did what they called a fright flight for us, and the pilots would fight over who could fly the airplane because they took a bunch of flight attendants and they would take and fly out of Kansas City, and they would do every emergency possible that they could anticipate and run you through it. They would accelerate, they would descend, they would dive, they would put it on a wing. And they made maneuvers almost like aerobatic flying. And they would show you what a G-force felt like, that your hands would raise up because of how fast you were going. And it was all airline people, so it wasn't like you had a real passenger on board. Mm-hmm. And they would do all sorts of tricks and flying to get you a sense of it. But by and large, most of it came just from experience. The more you flew, the more things that happened, and the more you realized that it was still the safest form of travel. I've always known that. And that there was so many redundancies built into the system of an aircraft. Mm-hmm. And we had such experience in the cockpit that there was never a time that I actually thought that I was going to die.
Right,
you just kind of learned to deal with it as things went along.
So for your fright flight, were the air traffic controllers told what they were going to do?
Sure.
So those guys weren't like, what's going on?
No. They knew it was cleared, and they actually called it that. And and there were people who washed out from training as a result of the fright flight because it was such a frightening experience for them if they hadn't flown a lot and realized that it just wasn't something they were cut out to do.
Right. And so do they still have this sort of the standards for looking a particular way and being a certain, when did that part of the culture start to change?
Part of it had to do with the EEOC, outlawing sex discrimination, age discrimination. They had returning mothers who, that you could be pregnant and take a maternity leave. And a lot of it developed as a result of government regulations. Mm-hmm. Other parts of it had to deal with just union contracts. And some flight attendants, through age discrimination, argued that people's body change the older they get because up until the 70s, no one got past 30 or 35 before they had to quit. So you had it evolve into a profession versus a temporary, have fun, fly me kind of attitude that I think was prevalent in the 70s.
So you used the phrase become a profession or turn into a profession. Do you think it was seen by other workers in the field of aviation that maybe it wasn't as serious or that that it wasn't I don't want to say as important, but that the work you did was not as much of a priority?
I think anytime you have a predominantly female workforce, you're going to run into the perception that, that it's not as important, and I think that's historically we've seen that. But what helped again with that was having males come on board, and that was something that was unusual in the airline industry. But I think more than other people in the airline industry, I think it was the public perception, because you had the glamorous, fly me ads. You had PSA, which is Pacific Southwest, that their flight attendants wore hot pants in the 60s.
Eastern had hot pants too.
And so you had a change not only in public perception, but you began treating flight attendants in uniform. Our uniforms evolved from the paper dresses and the hot pants into outfits that can best be described as more military looking, with stripes and bars and longer dresses and far more professional attire than what had been in the 60s.
Okay. Did you join a union from like the moment you became a flight attendant?
Well, we were a union shop in the 70s, and the union that represented the flight attendants was IFA, the Independent Federation of Flight Attendants. They were an independent union, and they represented the flight attendants at TWA. There were very few. The union for flight attendants was slow in evolving. Mechanics. You probably had more mechanics become union members because of their job or their roles with duty hours and working in a machine shop. And of course the pilots, they had FARs, Federal Air Regulations, that helped shape the number of hours they could fly, that restricted the number of duty hours they could have in any given time period. And it was only after the flight attendants began getting the same FARs, or Federal Air Regulations, that you saw the advent of unions in the flight attendant industry to help, change the work environment. It was pay, but primarily the work or the contracts that were negotiated dealt with work hours and on duty hours and those types of things, number of days a month you could work. So it really evolved just because the pilots had regulations, and I think that drove the flight attendants to have the same regulations.
Okay. So in terms of number of days a month you could work, what were your shifts? They must be very irregular.
Well, you were paid and are still paid primarily on flight hours. So the number, and that's aloft hours. It's not report time, but it's when you're airborne to when you land again. Mm-hmm. So our contract or our monthly schedule was not based on days worked, but on hours flown.
Okay.
And so that drove how many days you worked by virtue of how many hours you flew. And within that, there are federal air regulations that limit the number of on-duty or flight hours you can have in any given week, that you would have to have 24 hours off. And that the federal government, recognizing that flight attendants had a key role in safety, demanded that airlines allow this or promulgate the same rules that they have for the pilots.
So on a 12-hour flight, say to Beijing from the East Coast, how much of that time would a flight attendant actually spend up on the floor with the passengers working? I mean, do you get longer breaks or?
Well, I can tell you, 12-hour flight out of New York would be Tel Aviv. I flew Tel Aviv for years.
Okay.
On a 12-hour flight, we were entitled, and this is contractual, to a 2-hour duty rest, that we could be away from the passengers for 2 hours. That meant we could sleep.
And it's 2 consecutive.
2 consecutive hours. And so you would have shifts. You'd always have at least half your crew in the cabin, and then you'd have the other half. They would block off seats in business class for the flight attendants that actually had a curtain around it that you could sleep in a seat for 2 hours, that you could have the rest. So you'd do it. No break occurred until after a meal service was completed. Mm-hmm. And then after that, then you'd have basically 2 shifts. You have first shift and second shift, and a flight, half the crew, and you'd sign up for it, who wanted the first 2 hours and who had the second 2 hours. And then as you got to the start of the second service, then everyone was up. But you always had a minimum crew staffing out in the cabin.
Okay.
So you'd have 10 hours of duty
Okay.
in a typical 12-hour flight.
Okay. And of course, shorter flights, it's a much smaller crew.
Well, shorter flight, on domestic, you don't have crew breaks.
Mm-hmm.
On international, like say for Rome, you'd have an hour, because that was an 8-hour flight.
Okay.
Paris, which was 6 hours, you had no crew break. London, which was 5, you had no crew break. It just depended. After so many hours aloft, you would have to have a true crew break that you could rest before you had to go back on duty.
Okay. So I interrupted. We had started talking about the unions, and
Mm-hmm.
then I had that question. So you became involved almost immediately.
Right. We had union officers that had been in place for a very long time. And I was what was called an info rep. That I was not elected, but I was appointed by the union to give out information of what was going on with the union. For example, if we were in contract negotiations, how they were going, and we would be briefed by the union. And we were out on the line, so we had a special pin that we wore. It was called an info rep pin, and we would, if a flight attendant came up to us, we could let them know what was happening with the contract, with grievances, or anything else that was happening as it relates to the union and the company's involvement.
So how many flight attendants do you think also have law degrees?
At TWA, how many had? We had 6,000 flight attendants at the time that I was in IFA and then with the IAM. I would say we had maybe 6 to 10 flight attendants that actually had law degrees.
Okay. And do you think that sort of prepared those people specifically for collective bargaining? And
it all depended on what your degree was in. I had a friend of mine that's an attorney, and she was a civil rights attorney. So she was very involved in obviously the civil rights area in Washington, D.C. So she probably wasn't. Labor law is such a unique area of law that you really had to specialize in it. I think it helped you understand the contract if you had a law degree, because a law degree helps you in a lot of ways. But as far as the actual labor law issue, I think it behooved you if you had a background. When I did my thesis in law school, I did it on labor law, and actually I did it on the flight attendant industry, on the EEOC. That's why I was spouting off that information to you. And my law professor that I dealt directly with was a labor law professor.
okay.
So I was very interested in labor law just because I was involved in a union, represented by a union. So I probably focused on that area more so than I think other flight attendants who may have had law degrees.
So you're working as a flight attendant. You are a member of the union,
Right?
and when did you really become like what was
The impetus?
Yeah.
Well, there are
to
two
become
things.
really active with the union?
In 1985, Carl Icahn, corporate raider, took over the control of the airline.
And you only ever work for TWA?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're a flight attendant, you only work for one airline or another. You don't cross-train or cross-work at other areas, other carriers.
But I imagine some people, after TWA closed, still wanted to be flight attendants and went on.
To American.
Yeah. Okay.
Correct. Some during this, going back to the strike, what happened in 1985, Carl Icahn took over the carrier, and we were IFA was in the middle of contract negotiations at the time.
And what was his background to be in a position to take over?
He was a corporate raider. He had an advisor of his told him, basically he was a green mailer. He would go out and purchase green mailer.
What's a green mailer?
Comparable to being a black mailer, except instead of blackmailing you to keep something from you, a green mailer buys stock in your company and threatens to dismantle it, threatens to get rid of the board, threatens to get rid of executive management, unless you pay him a premium to go away. If he buys stock at $10, say, and he says, my stock, I bought it at $10, but if you pay me $12 a share, I'll go away. So it's a green mailer. It's a kind word, for being an extortionist. So he and he was constantly getting involved in various corporations, trying to see if a corporation had assets. Sometimes the sum of the parts are greater than the whole. He would break up big companies. He took on U.S. Steel. He would go out and take on the big powers and try and threaten to dismantle them and sell off assets. Well, Brian Freeman, who was one of his lieutenants, for lack of a better word, did a study and realized that TWA's pension plans at the time were overfunded. And if he could take control of the pensions, or take control of TWA, he would take control of the pensions and could take the surplus of the overfunding for himself. So literally, whatever money, he never put any money in it, but whatever money he convinced people to put in, he could then take that surplus money and reward himself or take it because it was his for the taking. So in 1985, he took control of the airline, and IFA, the union.
Was there already sort of weak management in place that sort of
Yes.
led to this happening?
Well, what happened was, at one time, TWA was part of Transworld Corporation.
Right.
And
so let's talk about
okay, back up.
We're kind of back and forth.
Sure.
I'm sorry, but
That's
there
all
are
right.
all these important components to really get us to that moment in 85 with the strike.
Well, in the 70s, Transworld Corp, which TWA was a part of, owned Hilton International. In fact, when we flew, we always stayed at Hilton International, on hotels in International, because of the fact that it was a TWC, which is Transworld Corp, was the parent company. TWC bought Canteen, which is a vending.
Okay.
They bought Century 21. They bought Spartan Foods. They bought all sorts of other entities using TWA money.
And were these all things that were at least peripherally related to the aviation airline industry?
Some, except I'm not sure how Century 21
Fair
actually
enough.
was
Fair
involved
enough.
in it, except it, unless you figure that employees move. But I would say for the most part, except for Hilton, I don't think there was a real correlation between the travel industry and Century 21.
Mm-hmm.
But they had used all that money. They'd taken the money that they had gotten from TWA, as I like to call it. It was like an ATM machine for TWC. And so they basically spun TWA off in 81, I think, or 82. They spun it off, and so we were our own entity, and they moved on with Century 21 and everything else. So we were out there as an airline without a parent corporation. When they spun us off, of course, we took our pensions with us. And at that same time, at least from a flight attendant union, we had gone from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan. They changed the pension. And the defined benefit plan is, you will guarantee me as an employer that when I retire, I will receive X number of dollars a month for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
You are guaranteeing me that. So you actually have to fund more money into a pension, because you don't, even though you rely on actuarial tables, there's still you have to promise me that your investment that you have in my pension will grow enough to satisfy my retirement or your retirement obligation to me. So they went from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan. And what a defined contribution plan says is, I will put 2% of your wages into a pension. I'm not telling you what it's going to be when you retire. I'm not guaranteeing you that it's going to be what you think it is. But as long as I put in 2%, I'm harmless. Mm-hmm. I can be held harmless. I'm not in trouble with you if, in fact, there's a shortfall in your pension, or if it doesn't help you make ends meet. And in doing so, quite obviously, because I no longer have to guarantee what you're going to get, there is a surplus in what has previously been funded for your pension.
Mm-hmm.
So there was, at least from TWA's perspective, the pension plan was overfunded. And that was a big draw for Carl Icahn to be able to go in and literally have a company by itself and yet give him the money. So that's what his initial foray into TWA was all about. It was to get to the pension plans, to get that money that some could call looting the pension plans, although he wasn't truly looting legally, but it was in fact looting the pension plan to take the overage.
And what was in place that allowed the company to switch the kind of plan?
Well, they just, at least from a flight attendant perspective, they sat down with the union and said, this is what we're changing the plan to, and the flight attendants accepted it. Which was a huge mistake.
So leadership with the union
allowed it.
And can I ask about that union? So there were more and more male flight attendants at that point. Who were in the positions of power? Who were the top level folks? Were they male or female or?
Well, actually, in the early 70s, Art Teolis, who is also now a general chair, or just retired as a general chair at the IAM, was the president of the union.
How do you spell his last name?
Teolis.
Okay.
And the vice president was Vickie Frankovich, Frankovich, Vicki, was the vice president. Art retired, and I can't tell you when, only he could. But Vickie then took over as president. It was the heir apparent, the successor. And so she took over as president of the union in the 70s. So when and Art left, I want to say Art left after 74, and then Vickie would have taken over right after 74. I think he left after that or 72, so in the early 70s. Then Vickie was president of the union for almost 20 years. And through that, we had in 1986, when we had, were trying to bargain with Carl Icahn, the union called an ill-fated strike in March of 1986. That when a strike is called after you've reached an impasse at the National Mediation Board, both parties are entitled to self-help. And what Carl Icahn did was, all the while, was what had been a 6-week training, went into a 19-day expedited training of replacements, and hired several thousand replacement workers. And then, of course, there were people who crossed the picket line who would also, you have to count on a certain percentage crossing your picket line. Mm-hmm. So he had a workforce in place between crossovers and scabs to take our jobs. And our strike lasted 3 months, and finally, and I was on the phone daily, if not hourly, with the union saying, we're losing. Mm-hmm. You've got to make an unconditional offer to return to work. And what drove that, the first week, the IAM honored our picket lines. TWA went into district court in Kansas City.
And by honored your picket lines, meaning their other employees did not go
cross the picket lines. Mm-hmm. I mean, the pilots crossed our picket lines.
ALPA. They were all ALPA. Okay.
Right. But if you have a mechanic or a ramp person who won't load bags or who won't fix an aircraft, mm-hmm. It was for all intents and purposes a sympathy strike. Mm-hmm. And the company, as I said, tell me who you vote for and I'll tell you who you get, because they appoint federal judges. And they went into court in Kansas City and got an order enjoining the IAM from honoring our picket line. So once that happened, we were on our own. Mm-hmm. And I argued with Vickie in person and with every other union rep union official, to call off the strike that we were losing. And when they finally called it off 3 months later, only 463 jobs exactly remained available to a 6,000 plus workforce. And it was a disaster. Apart from being replaced, which was economic hardship for 5,000 people,
Right.
The company was allowed to impose whatever work rules they wanted to, whatever pay they wanted to. And so they were literally operating ad hoc with whatever they had on the table.
And what? Because you talked about the union and about you talking to Vickie and trying to get them to
Call off the
strike. So among the rank and file of the union, I mean, was that a feeling across the board?
I think a lot of people, I would say 75% of the people realized it was a disaster. Of those who hadn't crossed. We had a crossover of about 1,200 flight attendants. So over 25, almost 20% of our workforce crossed the picket lines. And some not right away, but some as they saw the handwriting on the wall.
Right.
Crossed.
Right.
I mean, I've never crossed a picket line in my life, whether it's my own or anyone else's. But there are people who crossed, who went back to work. So with the percentage that crossed and the replacement scabs that they trained, we were effectively out of work for the bulk of the TWA workforce, flight attendant workforce, was out of work 3 years. For example, we went on strike on March 6, 1986. I was recalled back in 1989, in November of 89. So that is 3.5 years. Most of the TWA workforce was on the street.
And that's because so many scabs had been brought in.
So many scabs had been brought in, so many people had crossed, or a large enough percentage of people had crossed.
Right.
And the only way that we were brought back because of the unconditional offer to return was through attrition. If someone retired or someone quit,
So you had to wait it out.
we had to wait until they couldn't hire anyone else except because we made an unconditional offer to return. They had to offer us the right to return to work before they could hire off the street again.
And did they do that in order of seniority?
Yes.
Okay.
And
But it still took, because I imagine at that point your seniority was.
at that time, and I had 11 years when we went on strike. I came back with 14 because I did accrue seniority for that period of time that I was off.
So what did you do while you were off?
Well, I was fortunate. I mean, I already had my law degree at that time. I had graduated from law school in 1981. So I was working in a full-time in a law office. I still picketed every week for 3 years. Every Sunday at the Palm Beach International Airport, I was a star.
And by the time you got to the end, or toward the end of the 3 years, were you the only person out there on Sundays?
I was the only person out there.
Wow.
Rain or shine. I had a big pickup truck that had Boycott TWA on the side of it. I had a big banner. I negotiated with the airport because they tried to have my truck towed, and I threatened them and negotiated where I could park my truck so it was right as you came into the airport. Huge banner. And because I was informational picketing, I had the right to go inside and outside the terminal. And I picketed by myself and talked to people at the gates and talked to people at the counters and it was kind of like if it was Sunday, you knew where I was. So I was at the airport for
So
3 years.
Kind of known eventually as that crazy lady who won't stay home on Sundays?
Well, I should have brought the newspaper. I had an article. There was Palm Beach Post would run my picture. I have the old pictures from 86 and 89 of every Sunday we out there picketing. No, I mean, people understood it.
Yeah.
And, I don't think they thought I was nuts. I mean, I don't know what they thought. I know that they understood why I was doing it.
Right.
It was pretty obvious if you read English, boycott signs. But I think it was just an issue that it was the principle of the thing. As angry as I was with my union, the membership voted to strike, and I honored the majority rule. And, to the nth degree. During that same time, I was the largest fundraiser if I ever had. I was paying, because even though you're on the street, you have an obligation to pay union dues. I was holding raffles and bake sales and cake sales, and I paid dozens of flight attendants union dues during the time I was off because I didn't want them to fall behind when they came back to work and to have to pay union dues. I mean, they accrued. You didn't have to pay them, but you had large accruals, $900 accrual of union dues coming back to work, and you had 30 days to pay it when you're back on the property. So I was paying flight attendant union dues, not just my own, but other flight attendants along the way as we were waiting for recall.
Well, and until the strike was over, were y'all getting strike payments out of some kind of strike fund?
No strike fund.
You never had a strike fund for
no
that
strike
union?
fund.
Wow. That's harsh, as long as that strike.
You had no income other than what you brought to the table. There was no strike fund.
Well, how did you do the fundraising? Who was willing to put in money to help with your efforts?
It was me, myself, and I. It was,
So you were taking your paycheck that you were getting at the law firm.
using it to fund raffles and other.
Okay. And so then just the community, just people.
Right. I mean, I would do raffles, sell, buy things, sell things, do, like I said, cake sales, bake sales, to raise money to help pay for flight attendant dues.
Was anybody at least helping you with these efforts? Like helping you bake all the brownies or helping you reach out to the community? I mean, were you left alone?
Well, I mean, you have to understand, I wasn't West Palm Beach wasn't a domicile that, we have bases where flight attendants are based. You had New York, you had Los Angeles, you had Kansas City, you had St. Louis, Chicago, did I say LA, San Francisco? I don't know if I did that. So there were only a handful of flight attendants in West Palm Beach. And so there wasn't a large group to help. But it became sort of a cause, lack of a better word, for me to, carry on the fight. I mean, Carl Icahn was a corporate raider. Carl Icahn did take our pensions. Carl Icahn did engage in self-help. Carl Icahn had no business being in the airline. He didn't care about people, as he said, if you want a friend, get a dog. I would speak to him he lived in Palm Beach. And part of it was he flew in and out of there. And I wanted him to see my pickup truck. And the boycott TWA, every time that son of a bitch flew in and out of there. Who is that crazy woman out there? I would and he'd call me. He was actually very accessible for being scum of the earth. He liked talking. He's kind of like the Donald now, as I talk about and derisively. Carl never had a problem carrying on a conversation with anyone, so he would take your phone call. He'd call me, and he knew who I was, and I'd talk to him.
What would an average phone call? What would the topic of an average phone call?
Oh, it would start, like, hi, it's me. The woman with the boycott TWA truck out at Palm Beach Airport. And I'd say, Carl, and he would talk. He'd say, well, I understand, your union president led you over the cliff. You're like lemmings. And I said, it doesn't matter. I'm much more, this is where we are, what do we have to do? I'm not into revisionist history. I don't care. We are where we are. How do we resolve it? And he goes, well, I saved you. And I'm like, I just would go, oh my God, you're nuts. I said, you think I'm nuts? I said, you're saving me cost me money.
Right.
I said, how long have you had this Messiah complex and what are you doing about it?
You asked him that?
He loved, the more hateful you were to him, the more he enjoyed it. I called him one time, I said, you're the Jeffrey Dahmer of the airline industry. I said, you're an economic sociopath. Maybe I'll eat you today, maybe I won't. And he just laughed. he just thought that was hysterical. You know, because I like that phrase. I go, you're a Jeffrey Dahmer of the airline industry, and he took it. You gotta love a guy that doesn't, yeah. And he would say, "You're right. You know, you're right. I have no feelings for anyone." I mean, I would just say it, just, you know. He'd laugh, but we'd go on. But anyway, that was a long time coming. So part of my frustration had to do with the union and not being smart enough to realize that you had no strength as an independent, which then
and that union, that independent union, was only with the flight attendants with TWA.
Correct.
They weren't in any other.
No.
Okay.
No, they were not representing any other carriers, any other flight attendants anywhere, and they had no right to expect anyone at their own company to honor their picket line. So what are you going to do? And the truth of the matter is, we were expendable. If you can put what we used to call 18-day wonders on an airplane to do our job, you know, how hard, you know, and not realizing that we could be replaced, and the traveling public was not sympathetic to what we were saying, it was very easy to become frustrated, and it was a very poor economic decision, you know, for the union. I'm much more of a bottom line person. I'm not emotional. I can yell, but I'm not. I looked at it as from a business perspective. Cut your losses. What do you have to do? What's your end game? And the union failed and actually misrepresented facts that I knew not to be true.
What is the perceived benefit of being an independent union as opposed to being part of a larger union? I mean, is there...
That you don't answer to someone above you, that you're not having to listen to a different branch of a union, or having an international organization telling a local, you know, how to run things, when, you know, the argument is, well, two parties are removed, doesn't understand what the rank and file is going through. And that was their argument. I never understood that argument. I thought it was wrong, because strength in numbers. Everyone has always said that. It's a phrase for a reason. And the more strength you have, the more numbers you have. You know, I mean, I was talking to you about, I had taken Bob Haynes to Normandy, and one of the most graphic things you see is the invasion, D-Day, and it was a suicide mission. And you had just what caused any success was just sheer numbers. I mean, after a while, you run out of bullets. I mean, because you just have so many people coming, and these waves, that the suicide mission actually worked only because of the numbers of people that we threw at them. Heavy casualties. But, you know, that was the strength in numbers. And going forward with IFA, you know, when I began seeing that we were misled into the strike, I became even angrier. I certainly didn't want to not have a union, but I became angry with the direction the union was taking.
So after
89,
Artiolas,
Vickie
left, and Vickie Frankovich, was there just this assumption that she had trained under him and had been mentored by him,
Sure.
and that she would operate similarly, or were you already sort of seeing that maybe having an independent union wasn't great, and then under her leadership
times had changed,
became evident?
You know,
and it was post-PATCO, which I think gave the private sector a lot of courage to do things they wouldn't do before.
And I think, but part of it was that you talk about a strike fund. The companies, you know, had their own little packages set up for themselves, you know, in the event of a strike. And I think, honestly, in the 70s, it was the boom years for the airline industry, and it's the rising tide raises all ships. So what the union was getting was not by virtue of tremendous negotiations, but by virtue of the fact that the companies were flush with money and could provide greater benefits than before. The mark of a good contract is not how well you do when the company has money, but how well a union does when the company is claiming that it has no money. And I think the early 70s contracts were as a result of the company being flush with money and willing to give it to the flight attendants as compared to aggressive negotiations. That was my theory at the time, and I think it was true. I think Art and who else was involved in it would have agreed that the money, they'd ask for things and the company would say, sure, here. So it was a situation where it was very easy negotiations. Now, after I came back in 89 and it's more facts, and I saw, there was a real devastation of flight attendants out of work for 3.5 years. From a psychological standpoint to a financial standpoint.
Did you see that the quality of service had maybe gone down because of the
terrible.
poor training?
It was Carl Icahn had gone through an austerity program too. He was cutting corners on everything. So, we found ways to get even with Carl on flights, which I won't get into. But
I don't know. I don't think you can bring that up and not go into it.
It was like we had all this first class china. Like we saw the cup and saucer. Well, except back then it was even nicer china. And, it was like, take a plate, break a plate. And they actually got to the point on flights that they would send supervisors out on International, because that's all where you saw the china, and throwing things away, just ad hoc throwing stuff away. Bottles of wine and bottles of liquor and bottles and bottles and bottles and bottles. They got so bad on International that they'd actually have supervisors meet the flight and go through the garbage bins to see what was in there, to see if we had taken it out on Carl, because Carl was so furious that China breakage went through the roof. Well,
right.
People found a way to get past their level of frustration.
Well, it must have been satisfying watching a supervisor dig through garbage.
It was funny. It was humorous. And then they started having ghostwriters on flights.
To observe
Flight attendants. And I had my one experience with a ghostwriter, because they were idiots. I was working at 1011 and we were boarding. And right as you board at 1011, right where they used to, what's called the L2 door, and there was a big, huge garment bag rack right there. And a man gets on, running from God knows where, huffing and puffing with his garment bag, his own size, and it's hot, and he collapses with a heart attack right there on the spot. So, and this is pre, the AEDs. This is mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, the old-fashioned version. And he was, typical, 50s, middle-aged, overweight, hot, rushing. And so I'm on the floor literally doing CPR on a man as you're telling a flight attendant to call for emergency aid, at the end of the jetway. And, to save the man's life. And a ghostwriter wrote a report that I wasn't there to hang her coat in first class, which was my obligation. And I was called in on it. I said, you stupid idiot. What's more important, hanging this scab, because they were primarily scabs who were ghostwriters, coat, or performing CPR on a passenger who's dying? If you're really that stupid, then you don't get it. So that was, ghostwriters came and left very quickly because they realized that they really didn't know what they were doing. But that was some of the things that Carl imposed at the time, to see if he could get quality control back where he'd lost it from mental attitude of flight attendants coming back who were angry and were looking for a scapegoat. Carl was a scapegoat because he was so easy to hate. What's not to hate about a snake? But, as time went along, people then, as typical, began looking at the union as as a problem too. Like, why did you get us where we were? Why did we go on strike? And I think the frustration from flight attendants grew at the same time, mine included.
So you came back in '89, but I imagine that there were still folks who had seniority below you, that it took them even longer to get back.
Actually, no. With all my years of service, I was actually very junior.
Oh, so you were lower on the totem pole.
So at the very end, because when they first started calling, they initially called back 463 flight attendants. And that was the magic number, 463. So they are 280, and then 289, came back after that. So it was dribs and drabs initially. Like there were 400 in 1986, 200 in 1987, then like 600 in 1988. And then by that time they just said, screw it. I guess the company said that, and just brought everyone back, because we were coming back at a far more rapid pace, because there's more and more attrition. More people were retiring, people were quitting because they didn't like the work roles. The scabs they'd hired were disillusioned, because all of a sudden when they came back they were promised super seniority, which obviously wasn't upheld. Mm-hmm. The court said, no, you can't have special scab seniority. You don't get to be super seniority. So they felt lied to by Carl, which was kind of humorous. So as they went to the bottom of the seniority pool and no longer could fly Rome, but were flying Des Moines, and no offense to Des Moines, but they were having to fly the lesser attractive routes, their disillusion also grew. Mm-hmm. And so you had...
But it seems too that when you have this workforce that works in very close quarters, and half of them are scabs, and
it was ugly,
and half of them are the union members that they came in and replaced, or maybe not quite half and half, but you know what I mean.
It could be.
I can only imagine.
I think some of the first that came back, it was almost like Stockholm syndrome. You're so afraid that you don't say anything because you don't want to get fired,
right,
because they were outnumbered. But as numbers grew, as more and more flight attendants came back, and you saw it not so much on domestic flights, but the longer you're in a cabin on international, there were ugly incidents between flight attendants, as far as not wanting, not responding to them, not talking to them, certainly not going out on layover with them. So it was ugly. It was an ugly time for everybody, but particularly for the flight attendants, and it took its toll. It's hard, and we literally were issued scab lists from the union that you could look and see who you were flying with, and you had this little scab book. It was like a little book 3x5 with a paper cover, and just had names and payroll numbers, and you would, before you got on a flight to work, you would check to see who was or wasn't a scab.
And some of these people were hired on, but some of these people had been with the union.
Yeah, well, the replacement scabs were easy because they were all 4-digit payroll numbers.
Okay.
All the rest of us had 5-digit payroll numbers.
Okay.
So it was very easy to know who the replacement scabs were, because they were 4, and they all began with 4. So they had a 4, and it was 4 digits. You knew they were a replacement scab. Now the crossover scab, you had that scab book, and if you didn't know that they had crossed, which some, you knew some. Like I knew who in West Palm Beach had crossed just by virtue that they crossed. I knew we were a tight-knit community. But yeah, you would you would pull up your crew list before you got to the flight, and you would check off who was or wasn't a scab. So, as far as crossover scab, you already knew who the 86 higher replacement scabs were. For one thing, they were much younger than everyone else. But secondly, they had a 4-digit payroll number. They came with a 4. So it was not hard.
So can you tell us about a time that maybe you had an interaction with? For the most part, did folks go in and try to do their job and do it well?
You did your job, but you absolutely, there was no camaraderie.
Okay.
I never saw a flight attendant in all the flights that I worked ever let safety become an issue. Mm-hmm. But, you made it very clear that they were not your friends. You're not going to socialize with them. You will do your job with them, but no chit chat, no small talk. I don't care about you. You didn't care about me. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending to be my friend. You're not. I don't want to hear your story of why you crossed my picket line. I don't want to hear a story that I didn't know. You knew the first day that you went out there and saw a picket line. You're not an idiot. You're a scab, but you're not an idiot. So don't insult my intelligence by pretending to say I don't know, what you are. And some of the replacement scabs actually recognized me from my glory days at Palm Beach, and were just like, "Oh my God, there's that crazy woman."
I bet they were afraid of you.
Yeah, they
You're more than a little outspoken.
I don't think they ever crossed me per se. I mean, there was never a time that I let them get the upper hand. So they knew, who I was just by virtue of and it's word of mouth. I mean, you become larger than life, right, wrong, or indifferent. When you're standing face to face with and they're trying to have you arrested at the Palm Beach airport, and I have sheriff's deputies there and the head of the airport, and I'm saying things like, by the time I get through with suing you, this will become the Sherry Cooper International Airport because I will own this fucking airport. They just go, whoa, don't. And then they go, we'll have her truck towed. And I said, my brother-in-law, who I have Thanksgiving dinner with, is the tow truck company hired to tow vehicles here. Do you honestly believe that my brother-in-law will tow my pickup truck as he's having Thanksgiving dinner with me? I said, get real. I have a permit. I've gone to Palm Beach County. My license is in order. Don't fuck with me. And that's pretty much how it, and after that, they all left me alone at the airport, at any rate. Commander Pelly was his name. But yeah, they pretty much left me alone because they realized that I was not frightened of them. And again, having a law degree is a wonderful thing. But, I mean, that was then. But going forward, after Carl left, after he raided the pension and sold off Tibway assets, we were then left with a new management team, which was incompetent, to put it bluntly. And we went through two more, what they call restructuring, which is a euphemism for Chapter 11 bankruptcies. And we gave more concessions, which was hard because we'd already given a lot in 86. So by the time 95 rolled around, you get these SEC filings, which are that real thin tissue paper, it's about 150 pages and teeny tiny little font that no one ever reads through. I read through it. I spent every waking moment on an airplane because they have to mail it to me because I was a stockholder at the time, and I would sit on a jump seat, as you're on a ground stop, or sit on a commute flight home, reading every single line of that tissue paper thin SEC filing, and I'd realized, although the union never told me, that in fact the union had voted to give senior management a $10 million pay raise. IFA. At the same time that I was taking a pay cut.
And that was in
95.
So you went back in 89, and for 6 more years, it was still the independent union.
Independent Federation of Flight Attendants, IFA.
Yeah.
And when I saw that, I mean, I can remember just the blood pressure, my head throbbing, thinking, this is it. I've had it. I've been a good soldier. I have raised more money than anyone raised for you. I picketed for 3 years. I was the poster child for, how to behave at an airport, because the stories, of me, fighting, pilots on layovers, and I mean, stories spread. So I was pretty well known at that point, and I finally said, time for a change. That was my campaign slogan. And a friend of mine that I had actually gone through training with, Rocky Miller, and I decided that we were going to run, and we had an initial meeting with other potential candidates. It wasn't as crazy as the Republican debate the other night, but there were multiple people showing up, and Rocky initially was going to run for president, and he said, well, I'll have you run as vice president. And I walked out of the meeting and said, Rocky, we got to flip it. You're no match for debating. You're no match for, you're a great guy, love you. You're a wonderful person, but we have to have someone a little bit stronger personality-wise to take on other candidates who are running and the organization of IFA. So he agreed, and he and I ran on a ballot together, and we had a third person who unfortunately lost her slot, her secretary-treasurer slot. So but he and I both won our respective positions. But to give you perspective, I won the election. I show up a week before saying, okay, we need a transition. Even the White House, when they changed parties, transitions, and they made me sit outside in a hallway, wouldn't even let me in the union office in the inner sanctum. Zero transition. And of course the secretaries are all crying because the president's leaving, because they looked at me like I was scum of the earth. And they handed the keys and walked out. And that was my transition.
Really?
I sat there for a week. Every day I came up, I said, do you not want to let me know what's going on? I talked to the attorney at the time, Bill Jolly. I said, look, there's got to be some sort of transition. I need to know what's on the plate, what's happening. And he goes, we'll get to you. And they handed me the key to the president's office, and she walked out. Never looked. And this is a woman that I had campaigned for, a woman that she gave me awards for my contribution to the union. Wouldn't even look at me as she walked out the door. So already I knew I was in trouble. And, and it was any phone call I made.
But she couldn't have been surprised that the rank and file membership
I don't know.
Was ready.
I don't know. She was surprised. It was, I beat her there were two other candidates running.
4 people running for president at the same time?
Yeah, and I got 60% of the vote.
So by pretty much landslide.
If you had 6,000 flight attendants voted, I got, of 6,000 flight attendants, maybe 4,000 voted. Because you're always going to have apathy. I had 1,871 votes. She had 900 and, trickle down. So it wasn't, oh my God, nail biting. Am I going to win or am I going to lose? They wouldn't even, we didn't have a campaign headquarters or anything because it was grassroots. It was a true grassroots movement. And the best thing that I had going for me was that I was out there among the rank and file. Everyone knew me, or most people knew me, not everyone, but 90% of people.
They didn't know you, they knew your truck.
But, my boycott truck. But they knew me from flying, because I'd been out there and I had always been aggressive with the enforcement of the contract. If there was ever an issue on an airplane, I handled it. People knew that I knew the contract. People knew that I was an attorney. So there were a lot of things that people knew about me just from years of flying with me. And, you tend to fly with a lot of people. And 6,000 isn't a large number of people over a 10 or 12 year period to fly. You're going to cross paths with someone sooner or later. And so, I was at least known, throughout the organization, through the flight attendant ranks. But, there was no transition. And it was very ugly, even in the union headquarters, because, even though Rocky and I had won, we were still the minority in the board. So we were, kind of out there. And Rocky was such a nice guy and affable, and they still kind of liked Rocky Me, they hated. They hated me, which is fine. I mean, I've never been out to win popularity contests, or I didn't care. I mean, I knew the reason why they hated me was because I had won. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't like they hated me per se. They just hated me because I had unseated Vickie. But so my very first meeting that I had after my rather chilly non-transition was to meet with Bill O'Driscoll, who's the smartest union man I've ever known in my entire life. He was president.
Driskill.
William O'Driscoll. O-D, I call him O-D. O-D-R-I-S-C-O-L-L. He was president, directing general chair of District Lodge 142. Just a brilliant tactician. I mean, because as much as it is arguing a contract, you've got to be able to negotiate things that are non-negotiable, and he could do it. He's brogue. I can understand him. 90% of people who talk to him cannot understand him, I think, because that thick Irish brogue, OD, it was just, and he'd laugh, just typical Irishman, Johnny Walker Red and Water. That was his drink of choice. But, I met with him because we were coming up on negotiations again. And, I do have an elephant memory. I could remember 1986. And I said, what are you going to do to help me get a better contract for the flight attendants? They deserve it. Mm-hmm. Because of all the concessions that were given among the three labor groups, the IAM, which is mechanic and passenger service, and ramp, and the pilots and the flight attendants, the self-help that Carl implemented was far more draconian than anything they had to give up. Mm-hmm. We had greater ground to make up just to get even with the rest of the rest of the employee groups, mm-hmm. because we had given up so much.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but so did you talk regularly to the machinists and the airline pilots? Did your union talk, was there ever this acknowledgement we're all sort of parts of the...
I don't know that there was... the pilots were difficult to talk to because they actually... I've always said the pilots union is management and drag. Mm. I don't think they've ever seen themselves... I saw a quote once of a Harry Hoglander, who was the president of the ALPA back when I was there, HOAGLANDER, once said the difference between the mechanics and the pilots is that we're professional and they're not. And I always thought that was, apart from being incredibly condescending, define professional. Because you got your training compliments of the military, you sat in the front seat, everything you got through the government or the GI Bill or whatever. So don't tell me you're professional, and they're not. These guys have... I was at LaGuardia during the one of the bombings they had in the 70s, when the Croatian bombing, free Croatia. And it's frightening when you hear the bomb go off.
So you heard it go off?
Oh, I was there. And at the airport.
You were there.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I was on an airplane and you hear, and the bomb exploded at the TWA concourse down. That was before, when they had concourse, the baggage claim was outside security. Now, of course, it's inside security. That you have to get in, they protected security, and we walk into LaGuardia, you walk right into baggage claim. There was no safeguard, anyone could walk in. And they exploded a bomb. And I saw the mechanics running out to pull people out.
So people were already on board the plane and it was getting ready
to leave, and then you hear the bomb explode. And the ramp to get to baggage claim from underside the LaGuardia, the ramp takes the bags, on those little conveyor trucks, and then they open this little side door and their conveyor belts, and they're throwing the stuff on, the conveyor belts. And I saw the ramp people running out to pull people out of the wreckage. So, tell me anything more professional than risking your own life, because you don't know how many bombs there are. Risking your life to save total strangers. That, heightens the level of professionalism in my book. So I always, having seen that, always thought that was an amazing statement to make. Mm-hmm. Apart from condescending, it's an incorrect statement, to make. But anyway, going back, so no, I didn't spend a whole lot of time talking to the pilots. Because, I talked to them, that's not it, but they were a joke. But I met with William O'Driscoll, and I was in 96. And I said, because where they had given up 15% pay cuts, Carl Icahn imposed 22% on flight attendants, just because he could. So we were already well behind what they were as far as our contract, apart from work rules and other benefits. But he said, really, there was not a whole lot I could do. And I said, well, how about if we joined you? And he goes, that sounds like a plan to me. I said, that's good. So he and I had secret talks, because I knew the rest of my executive board, except for Rocky, would never approve it because we were the minority. And I'd already, if they didn't already hate me, they hated me after I took office, because the first thing I did was cancel all the credit cards because they were using reversal expense. I'm like, okay.
The executive board?
Yes, I canceled all the credit cards. I took away any expense report that had liquor on it. So I'm not going to pay you to drink.
So you were elected, but the same executive board was still in place. Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, so I was a minority. Rocky and I were a minority. So yeah, but I did have certain presidential privileges. Because, well, actually what I said was, because you had countersigned checks, I'm not going to sign off on any credit cards. So feel free to use them. Feel free not to get reimbursed. I will never sign a check. So if you want to use your corporate credit card at the same time that flight attendants are out there struggling to make ends meet, I won't sign a check. And yes, you're here, and if you have, you come in for work and you're working overnight and you're working on arbitration or grievance, and I'm going to pay for your dinner, I will not cover alcohol. I don't pay people to drink. So don't submit an invoice for alcohol. Won't happen. If you want to have a drink, have a drink. I'm not a prude, but I'm not paying for it. Not out of union dues, because that's where flight attendants aren't paying to have you have a drink. They're paying for you to do their work. So little things like that created conflict. All this is coming back like a fond memory. Just joking. It's not fun. But so anyway, so we already had animosity, and then Flight 800 happens, and I crash off Long Island, and I spent 6 months of my life. Well, the first night I identified bodies, and I spent 2 weeks, with CNN and Larry King and television and newspaper, and it was just never ending.
Was this the flight that had a student group on it that was okay? I remember
Montoursville.
that. I remember.
Yeah, I was the union president there. I was out there bashing Giuliani day and night because he was an idiot, and OD sent me out there to take him on. So,
how does something like that affect the morale of? Because it was ultimately determined that it wasn't a terroristic act, that it was.
That's the story.
Okay.
I don't believe that story because they could not recreate it. They could not recreate that scavenge pump. I could take. I don't know what I have. Like, you know how you have like a little zip of electric, like when you have static electricity, and
it's a quick pop.
Yeah. And when the Rome flight crashed, airplane fuel, Jet A fuel, is not like gasoline. It's not like gasoline you put in your car. When the Rome flight happened and they crashed, and people were soaked in diesel fuel, Jet A fuel, and they got off, as Italians can only do, lighting cigarettes that got them alive. They didn't immolate themselves. They weren't Buddhist monks. Jet A fuel, you could take a match. I could take jetty fuel, and Bob Baxter and Bob Haynes could tell you this too. Light a match and put the match out. It's not gasoline. And to say that little static electricity pump caused that plane to crash is ludicrous. I spent 4 months out at Calverton where they kept the plane in the smell and the dirt, identifying body and body parts and helping put the plane back together. One thing they never counted on for that, the one unique thing that TWA had more than anything else was we numbered all our seats. So we can tell you where every part. I spent 4 months helping put that plane back together. And we could identify each seat. And
so the actual seat number was on every seat.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Unlike just above in the bins.
Okay.
Every seat, every armrest, every little, like this.
Okay.
29-1.
Okay.
So you could tell.
You could put it.
And you could take. We had 53 crew members, TWA family on that plane. Crew members, non-revs, children of non-revs. So we had, the bulk of the 251 people that died, 53 were TWA people. But they did autopsies, and you could see from the L3 door to the R2 door. First of all, we had a complete inventory list of all people. And we had a deadheading crew on. So we took them out because deadheading crew members move. We tried to find the best seat because they wanted to stretch out and sleep on the flight. So we threw out all the crew members because we know they all migrate to get a better seat for a long flight. But we kept passengers with families because we knew passengers with families would stick together. I mean, you don't leave your kid. Right. You don't go 6 rows back on takeoff. And so we realized that those people tended to stay in their assigned seats. And from the L3 door, which is the third door to back on the left as sounds, to the R2 door, there was a straight line of autopsy. And I saw the autopsy reports. I saw bodies. So, I saw what I saw. Of decapitation along a straight road going out. And the L3 door back of, I flew 747 for 20 years. There's what they call a door assist handle to help you as you're deploying the slide so you won't get knocked down. You hang on to it for dear life when you deploy a slide. It's a 2-story drop down at 747. It's pretty amazing when you look out. And you've got to be able to shove people out, shove their butts, because they're not, when you see how big of a drop, even though the slide log is still a drop, especially with people afraid of heights and disoriented. That door assist handle, which is double bolted, double bracketed, for you to hang on to, because you need to hang on to it, was facing inward, because it's a door handle, so it sounds like inward at the R2 door, embedded into the frame of the aircraft. I had a friend of mine, Sandy, who had metal in her that couldn't be identified, and she always had
any part of the plane or any part of anything else you'd ever seen.
Part of the plane. And she had a unique habit. Because I flew, as I said, for 20 years with these people. She always took her uniform off before she flew. So I always knew, because people were in the same position. We're creatures of habit. And based on seniority, you know who works first class, you know who works coach, you know who works what position. And we knew and I knew where she was sitting. And from the neck down, she was less than an inch thick. She'd been flattened, which is unheard of. Eli Gueveno, who's a very close friend of mine, had a slight bruising on his cheeks, and we knew where he was. Eric Callis, who was upper deck, we had epaulets and had a little thing. We had a little ID card. His ID card was still on it, and he looked alive. He looked like he was sleeping. Mm-hmm. He looked alive. But Jimmy Hall and Connie Charbonnet, their skin was ripped off, and their skulls were. And I identified her because she had just gotten her hair cut, and she had long hair, and they cut, and I had just seen her, so I could identify her. And their bodies, their rib cages were entwined. The impact was so great for them. Upper deck, there's the glass. glass glasses that were totally intact. When they pulled Ralph out, who was the captain, who was a really good friend of mine, his wrists were broken, his leg and his ankles were broken. He was still flying the airplane to the very end. His watch was still working. 3 weeks later, at the bottom of the ocean. I watched Navy divers go down because they had it all taped, and there would be excerpts missing. I mean, you can watch, the time log at the bottom of anything, time log, and all of a sudden it's a gap, and then all of a sudden it's something else, and I go, where's the 20 minutes? It's like the Rosemary Woods tape from Richard Nixon. You're too young to remember, but the tape is missing, and they go, oh, it's national security. And I go, what's national security about an airplane crash? They go, we know you're an attorney. And I'm like, how do you know that I'm an attorney? I'm the president of the flight attendant union. How do you know that? We've checked on you. And the very first day I walked out there were admirals there. There were all sorts of high ranking military. And I said, who are you? What are you doing here? And I said, is there a missile that's out there, yes or no, that could cause the damage I've seen to this aircraft? And the admiral turns to me and goes, we didn't shoot it down. I said, that's not my question. Is there a missile out there? I watched things walk out of that Calverton, items, property that were not cataloged. They made it clear that they were bugging our phones to hear what we had to say.
When you say things walked out, like things that they found in the wreckage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that things went out the door directly, and they said, well, the scavenge, that fuel tank exploded. I said, really? I said, because directly in front of that is the potable water. It's about the size of a large water heater, which is, and it's fiberglass because lightweight for air travel, which is highly. Have you ever taken a baseball bat to a piece of fiberglass? Mm-hmm. How it shatters? Mm-hmm. I had a cousin that had Corvettes, and they pieces strewn all over. They hit a bump, pieces all over the place. That thing was like you had just taken an egg and cracked it and gently. It looked like it was perfect. I said, that thing is intact. How can that be intact if it's directly above this huge explosion that you claim happened, that you went to England and tried to replicate and couldn't? I said, it's impossible. I will go to my grave knowing that it was not the scavenge pump. I watched mechanics, IM mechanics, and I don't think you realize, maybe I'm insulting your attention. The wiring on a 747 is like spaghetti. I mean, they're just wiring all through that. And I saw, and I can't give you direction because we're back, I need to, out to the street and back 10 times of how they straightened out all that cabling and wiring. Mm-hmm. And what people don't realize was that the night they took off, El Al was directly
and they
ahead
left which airport?
Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
El Al was scheduled to be in our slot, but
El
Al
okay,
was scheduled to be in our slot. Mm-hmm. And we were delayed. The inbound flight was delayed. So we were in the El Al slot for takeoff out of Kennedy, and white aircraft, different lettering on the back and different colors slightly, but you got a 747 that's white. I mean, they look a lot alike from a distance. Mm-hmm. So no, I'll never believe that. Never, ever, after what I saw and smelled out there, of body parts. And there was the cutest little girl on the flight, and I pulled out her jeans out of that, because they would bring stuff up, the grapple and the grasp, they called them, the Navy ships. They were bringing up debris.
Did everything pretty much sink then when whatever happened?
Parts of it. A lot of it floated initially.
Okay.
A lot of the fuselage floated and stuff. But they brought her up, and she had we had glitter in the car. I mean, it's weird what you carry. We were carrying we were dumpster diving, because they bring it all in and you'd go climb in it. And can you imagine a hangar that's about 120 degrees. It's just hotter than hell. No air conditioning, this big hangar. And metal on top of it, which is not reflecting any heat. It's just absorbing all the heat. And I pulled out this little girl, and I had her jeans, and I opened up, it was like a piece of paper that was folded. She had drawn a picture of a rainbow. I'll never forget this. It was on her, and I folded it over. How little kids draw rainbows. But we had glitter in the cargo hold, like 500 pounds of glitter. And I opened it up, and there was just glitter inside was inside her little packet. And it was just amazing. The sights, the sounds, the smells. It was nothing quite like it. So anyway, but after that, I went through that. So we had signed a secret deal with the IM. I had signed a secret deal with the IM, and I told Rocky, and she was all for it. My other minority.
And that event was sort of
96
with,
happened. It was the 50th anniversary,
okay.
and then TWA Flight 800 happened on July 17, 1996. Okay. So I'd signed the deal. Like I come president in January of 1996. Met with him, signed a deal like in May of 96, something like that. After I met with him. Going to announce in June, Flight 800 was in July, it gets pushed back, and then he leaks it. To
whom and how?
Through a flyer, bulletin, something.
So he doesn't leak it; he announces it. That's what it sounds like.
It was. All depends who you talk to. He just cackled. Well, I wasn't cackling at the time because that's when I'm coming back from TWA headquarters, and I'm being told that I'm stripped of my power. They didn't actually rip my epaulets off or ribbons off or anything. That I'm locked out. That I'm being charged with treason for entering into this secret agreement with the IM. I said, well, we were going to have to vote on it. Membership was going to have to vote on it. It wasn't like I signed away our livelihood.
Right.
It wasn't something that, I could just poof, wake up, magic wand, we're all now IM. I said, don't be ridiculous. Well, they didn't treat, the union attorney had been the union attorney there for 25 years, so this was his, that's all he did. Was handle that IFA. So I was like telling him he wasn't going to get his $250,000 a year job. So he wasn't happy about it. So anyway, they had a trial. They sued me in federal court. They charged me with the assault, millions of dollars of damages from me for destroying the union or whatever. I don't know how I destroyed it because they were still operating. I was back on the line at that time. They, of course, convicted me of treason.
Can you be convicted for treason if it's not an action against a government?
Well, they had it in their bylaws.
Okay.
I think it was...
It seems very dramatic.
I know, but they were very dramatic. It was, oh my God, she was a plant by the IAM. I'm like, oh yeah, right. I was just mad over the $10 million bonus. I wasn't like planning this great revolt. It wasn't like a coup. That I pretended that I was something, but, go ahead and make me sit outside the hallway for 7 fucking days without letting me in. and then as I'm telling you, I'm not going to sign your credit card debts, your credit card payments. Yeah, I think there was bad blood. But anyway, that's water under the bridge. But yeah, it was treason. That's what they were arguing. They were passing out flyers, all flight attendants. I've destroyed the union. It's all my fault. Again, revisionist history. Like nothing, like the strike was all my fault too, I guess. They didn't say that, but it was, I was destroying the union. I'm like, what union? But, so anyway, we began the full representation election. Anyway, get cards, and that was Bob Bax. And I walked those corridors of St. Louis for days and weeks getting signature cards, because you have to get 35% cards into the NMB to hold an election, representation election, which we got. And then the NMB held the election, and IM won, and that I was president of the local, which is Local Lodge 1997, because that was the year that it happened, 1997.
And that was
Local.
The election was at the end of 97. No, it was the beginning of 97.
97. And then I became, right after that, I became general chair for the flight attendants in 1998. And I was one of the, and that's when I took my board seat on the TWA Board of Directors seat, because now the stock that we had gotten as part of the 95 restructuring allowed us a board member seat, and so I became the board member for the flight attendants.
And you were headquartered out of
St. Louis.
St. Louis, and your first contract. How was that received by the rank and file membership?
It was great. It was one of the best. Well, first of all, we got pay raise. We got phenomenal work rules. We had the best trip protection in the industry. What trip protection means is if I go out on a flight and it cancels under the old contract, I was out of luck. SOL. And I had to make up flights, because even though I'd shown up when I was supposed to, if something happened, and whether it's storm, weather, mechanical, whatever, I didn't get paid. I had to make up my trips in order to get paid. Fly more hours, because I got a call out pay of 2 hours. I had a 22-hour trip. All of a sudden, I'm down 20 hours. Mm-hmm. And as I said, we're paid by the hours of the month. Under what I was able to negotiate was, I show up, my flight cancels, I get paid 22 hours whether you fly me or not.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
It was the best, as I said, trip protection language in of all. I had every flight attendant union in the country call me going, "Can I have a copy of it?" And I'm like, "Sure, if your company will agree to it." But we had absolute total trip protection. Now they could still fly me, but I still had the right. I was guaranteed 22 hours whether I took a leg, went home, flew a trip, flew 1 day trip, 2 day trip, but they could never fly me beyond what I was scheduled to fly. Mm-hmm. To catch up. Mm-hmm. And they had one shot to do it. They couldn't say, "Okay, fly today, I'll give you this little trip, and then call me back tomorrow and I'll fly again," because a lot of our flight attendants were commuters, and I'm in a hotel room. I'm like, "No, you get one shot at it. If you don't set me up on a trip within 2 hours of my trip canceling, I get to go home. And you have to pay me 22 hours. So, and it covered every single possible event that could happen. So, and we got a pay raise on top of it. And we got a lot of other work rules. But, sick bank, we were protected. If I called up sick, I got 100% pay. So there are a lot of things that we got back that we had lost in the strike.
And did Bill O'Driscoll help negotiate?
Bill didn't know. He had general ideas of what a flight attendant did, but he was a ramp server. They were 9 to 5. Mm-hmm. They didn't have work. They weren't paid by flight hours. They were paid by the number of days a week they were. And he, God love him, he absolutely said, "It's your baby, go for it. I'll back you up on it." And from a legal standpoint, he was confident with me because I had studied contracts, at that time, and I'd done some labor, and I'd done grievances, and I'd done a lot of other things, on my own. So he was fairly confident of the language. And I got to write all. The company was so stupid. That's that Terry Hayes guy I was talking about that was the bigamist. He let me write it all because he was in over his head. So I wrote it and said sign, and he signed it. And one time I had the the chief legal counsel, Kate Solid, called me up on the whole sick bank policy, which was the best in the industry, and she goes, "Why didn't you tell us this was a bad deal for us?" And I laughed and I said, "Wait a minute, who do you think I represent?" She was furious that I didn't let her know that the company was signing such a bad deal.
She thought it was IFA 2 or something?
No. She was as sure as I am.
But you know what I mean, the quality of a contract.
She goes, "Why didn't you tell us it was such a bad deal?" And and I said, "Well, and I would talk to crew schedulers who were just fascinated because they had to totally reprogram everything." Mm-hmm. And they were laughing, saying this was phenomenal. We were laughing, and I'm like, "I know." It was just okay, what do I sign? Because they didn't understand the overall impact. They didn't have what I would call a global perspective of what would happen as far as implementation. because they were so focused on the dollar pay raise when I was looking more at work, language, work roles that impacted, because I had flown for 20 years, so I knew how badly the work roles had been, eviscerated by Carl Icahn. So,
because one of my follow-up questions was going to be, how did you get them to so easily sign that contract with you? And it's just because they really didn't understand what they
didn't understand the language, because he had no flight attendant background, and the company, who they put in charge was someone who really truly did not understand the flight attendant lingo, or the language, and how the work roles would be implemented, because his only experience was with, again, mechanics and a ramp 9 to 5. You show up at 9, you leave at 5. Flight attendants and pilots, our work roles are totally tied to trip rig and duty rig and flight rig and all these things that are, unless you're in it every day, don't truly understand it. So it was interesting. And then, then the whole thing happened with Terry getting her, put falsies on her and dress her up like a bride and sell her. And they sold off our assets, basically. And American took over. And I retired.
And what year did American take over?
2001 was the restructuring deal, or what they call the restructuring. And then I left, I actually officially retired in 2007. I still worked for the IM, and the IM still represented them until the representation election in 2002. And then by that time I was furloughed again because the American Airlines had downsized.
And were the TWA workers the first to go?
Yeah. Welcome to my, it's like deja vu all over again. Yeah, it's like Groundhog Day, only a negative Groundhog Day. And so then I when they recalled me in 2007, I said, I'm done. This is like, I spent enough of my insane life dealing with the airline insanity. And I tell you that the IM was the best experience of my life in every positive way. I have nothing but wonderful memories of the organization, and particularly of District Lodge 142. William O'Driscoll was, I've never had anyone just give me unfettered control, or say, I'll back you up 100% no matter what you do. I know your agenda's correct. I'll back you to the nth degree and do what's right for the flight attendants. And it was a very liberating experience dealing with the IM. I had my battles with the International, but that was.
Do you want to speak to those, or do you not feel comfortable speaking?
No, that's really more, I think, personality issues, because I think my personality was sometimes a little difficult for them, and it's true. They didn't really, understand, the whole flight attendant thing and what we'd been through. I don't think, but. I will say that, it's, it was the best thing that ever happened to flight attendants. And it was the best thing that happened to me. It gave me a lot of freedom to do for the flight attendants what they had lost in '86. And, and it was something that, as short-lived as it may have been, and as much of a roller coaster. You talk about losing sleep when you're facing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. You're going, okay, Mom, I'm just going to cite your name on my deed for no reason, okay? Just in case.
With TWA, when did you sort of see the writing on the wall, right? That things were going south?
It was a long history of things, but honestly, to give you perspective, we literally had a whole New Deal structured, and to this day, TWA would still be in existence. As much as I'm convinced that Flight 800 is what it is, and for what I saw, I'm equally convinced that TWA would have remained in. But I had the vote. I worked to get the votes from the board. I actually tried to be nice, which was like really, really hard for me. Be pleasant, not be nice, be pleasant, civil, and civility is overrated. But the pilots screwed us out of it, because the big cause, Bill Compton convinced I needed their one vote. They said I had it, and the very last minute, they withheld their vote at the board. And
Okay.
I said, and the one
Withheld their vote to do what?
to bring in a new executive management,
Okay.
and one of the pilot board member called me and says, like I said, it's one of those nights you never forget where you were. That he goes, you can take credit for this. I said, I want absolutely nothing to do with this deal. I said, you've screwed us and you'll regret it, because it's not, if something sounds too good to be true, chances are it is. And I said that to him, and I said, it is. It is not what they're saying it is. Don't be an idiot. And I said, and that's when Bob, we were talking about it, and I stood there in San Juan, and I said, I said, so what is the going rate for prostitution nowadays? I said, you're nothing but a fucking whore for Bill Compton and the company, and they will screw you. I said, just tell me what is your new hourly rate? Because I said, the only thing you have is your word, and if your word doesn't mean anything, you're dead. I said, you're dead to me. I said, you swore up and down, and you lied. I said, so go to hell. And that was pretty much it. So, not for lack of trying, but anyway, I have really, I said, great memories of the district, and I have great memories of Bob Haynes, who's just a salt of the earth guy. His word is worth something. He's always made fun of the way I talk and the words I use in the language, because he's not like that. But he has been a staunch supporter of mine, and I would fight to the death for him. Mm-hmm. And Bob Bax is just a generally nice guy. I don't know if it's Kansas City in them, I don't know, but Bob has so much integrity. And you can't put a dollar amount or a price tag on the value of knowing someone like that. Apart from the other things of why I'm a staunch union person, but it's priceless. For having those memories of people who I never met anyone who I didn't think, short of a couple of people I can't talk about. I've never met anyone in this district who I didn't think, had their constituents at heart. Mm-hmm. I don't think it was ever an issue of, you look at the office, we're not talking a grand office and, and very basic kind of stuff. And I just know that they have always really cared about the rank and file. And what's not to like about that? Mm-hmm. And I look at IFA headquarters downtown in a high-rise glass, all new furniture, all new everything, building. And I'm thinking, what are we doing? I work out the back of my truck. Before I would, spend the money on a gross net lease because I want a sky, penthouse office building. When I worked for them, I made it a point, and I flew 1 day a week, every week, even as president, until I got thrown out. I said, because, and I said it wasn't a gimmick. It really wasn't, because, how else are you going to keep in touch with people unless you're out there with them? I just think that, I see Bob, and Bob truly cares about people still. He's retired, but he still wants to take care of people. Mm-hmm. And that's what's good about a union, because it shows the amount of it's not just negotiating a contract, it's taking care of people. And that's what, I learned from OD and what I learned from Bob. I don't know if I've toned down any. I'm laughing. I'm sure I have. I don't know.
So you said that the machinist represented the flight attendants through 2002.
From 1997 till 2002, 5 years.
Okay. So, and then at that point,
We were stapled at the bottom of another independent union, American professional flight attendants, the American Airlines flight attendants, who are now merging with U.S. Air. But we were stapled at the bottom of the American Airlines seniority when they bought the so-called assets of TWA.
But you said you stayed on with the machinist for a few more years?
I stayed. I then ran. Oh, that's not my next one.
Yeah.
Then I ran for union office at APFA just to be a thorn in their side.
APFA.
Association of Professional Flight Attendants.
Okay.
That's the last remaining independent union of flight attendants at American. So I held union office for 2 more years. And then I retired. So I went from IAM, I ran for union office for APFA, and that's when I was talking about the Department of Labor thing, where they John Ward, who was then president of APFA, who hated TWA flight attendants, thought we were beneath them.
Sky waitresses.
Yeah, I know. Well, he looked at us. He said, we saved you, and I'm like, this Messiah complex, as American filed for bankruptcy again. But I said, when the carriers at one time in the 60s were all part of a pact, and to help each other out during strikes, and you were talking about that with the strike fund. Well, the companies had one, and Bob Crandall, who was the original Sky Nazi at American Airlines, who retired, was a former senior vice president at TWA. So, it is kind of like baseball managers. They just kind of go to other carriers. And at one point, TWA covered American Airlines payroll, or else they were going to shut the doors. I said, it's short-term memory. I said, you have a guy that comes out of TWA who reaches back to his old cronies at TWA, and we cover their payroll. Well, that's how close they came to shutting the doors. And we saved them, and they look at us like we're leeches, you don't get it. You have no history. It's the old, those who don't remember history didn't repeat it. I said, that's kind of where they are, and they were so superior, and then of course they filed for bankruptcy, and then all of a sudden they're shocked that American Airlines, oh my God, we had all the right stuff. And I said, it's the whole astronaut thing. I said, how quickly you fall. Mm-hmm. And I don't know where the airline industry is going to shake out, but the one thing that, if I look back at least my career, apart from on the union's part, I got to see it during the golden years, if there are such thing. It's, my mind, but you don't see linen anymore. You don't see China. You don't see, all the glassware and the stemware and the 5 carts and the, the stars and all. It's just kind of, it's depressing. You don't see any of that, where at least I got to experience and witness and see just how great things were. It really was a phenomenal career during that segment of time. If you compartmentalize your life, it's 75 to 85 was the glory, the golden years, when you had all this stuff, and then of course you had the strike, 86 to 89, and then you have the turbulent, 89 to 95, that I was running around like a crazy person after the strike, unhappy, and then you have the union, and then the treason. So I have compartmentalized my life, I guess, and this is a career. But I have fond memories of TWA from the 75 to 85. Of course, then you have the strike, which was disastrous for people, and then you have the good part, and then you have Flight 800, which was terrible, and then you have the IM again. So, there's been some really phenomenal events within, the airline industry, within TWA, and then, like I said, I have nothing but positive memories about the IM.
Okay. So, what have you been doing since you retired altogether from
Well-
airlines? And
Well,
Vivian?
I'm still practicing law.
Mhm.
Took the day off from work to come up here and regale you with my disgusting, with my horrible stories. But anyway, no, I'm still doing bankruptcy and family law, and I have a little small office. And like I said, up until my mother dying last month, I took care of her, for the last 3 years since she fell, and now she's died. So it's very quiet at my house now, and my dog's very depressed, and I'm taking care of him. And my nephew's coming Thursday to go to Geneva, and life goes on.
Is there anything else that you want to discuss that maybe we haven't covered, or any story particularly? I know you've got fun stories about folks, or
No, I think I've probably taken too much of your time.
I'm not sure that is absolutely not true.
But
Well, if you don't have anything else to add, I think we're finished.
okay.
I have to tell you, this has been a wonderful interview. Thank you so much for not only agreeing to do it, but flying all the way in from Florida
That's
to
okay.
to
It was
do
nice
that.
meeting you, and I'll go through my stuff, when I go back through and see what I have. So
All right. And we're wrapping up at just a little over 2 hours.